All right, guys, welcome to Chapter 3 of the Linux Plus preparation course. Today we're going to be talking all about users and groups. So remember in Chapter 2 we were talking about the basics of Linux. We talked about the CLI, the shell, bash. We talked about the commands themselves, man pages, help resources, and we practiced a little bit along the way. So today we're going to take it a step further. We're not going to be the only ones ever using our systems, so now we're going to learn how to add users and groups and modify them. Remember, we need to understand that in order to do something like this, we're going to need the super user account, which is root. We're going to need to learn how to use sudo in order to perform all of our administrative tasks. We're going to create, modify, and delete users and groups, query the system to make sure we did it properly, and then understand how account profiles work throughout the environment, at least when it involves with the bash system. Now, Linux was built from the ground up as a multi-user operating system. It's back of the day of the Unix mainframes, and so be aware that because of that, the operating system is heavily set up for multiple users accessing the system at the same exact time. Users need an identity, and so they'll get accounts that are handed out by IDs, and this will prove who they are. Just like with any other operating system, usernames and passwords are pretty much common knowledge as of today. This is where they're going to get access into the system. Now remember, access is not only as far as we're going to go, we're going to move into permissions. Permissions are like the key cards. Just because they're allowed to enter the building doesn't mean they have full reign over every building or every room in the building. So what can the user do and what can they not do? And so identity and access will be controlled by the operating system through various methods. Now the super user in themselves is called root. Root is God. They have the power to do anything on the system. Root is the username as well as the group. Think of it like the master key. They have keys to every room of the building. They can do anything. Even if you try to lock them out, they don't follow the rules. They will always be able to access the system. Now, how do you remember what type of user you are? Well, it's based off of the prompt. Remember, the $sign at the end is safe, limited privileges. You cannot do too much to destroy the system. You can make your life, trouble. Remember, using rm-r is a very bad command, especially if you're trying to use the all-powerful root user. So if you see the hashtag at the end of your prompt, you are root, you can do anything, including making your life a living hell. So remember the principle of least privilege. Now, this is a security principle, but it is a principle for all system administration. We don't want to give all the users administrative access because this makes the risk very high that someone is going to make a mistake and delete something out of the system or change a file or do something that, will interfere and interact with all other users. So by default, we don't log in directly as root. The accidental damage is way too high. We actually have a command for that. So how do we become super user? There are two different ways. If we really need a root shell, we can switch user, SU, and log in as root. Now, this is very uncommon now. We don't use it as much, mainly because as root, we can do anything to the system. Now, this is very insecure, not safe, and we try not to do it. Now, on the other hand, if we want to run a single command as root, which is pretty common, we want to run a command as an administrator on a system, we will run a sudo command. So we will switch user and do a command. Now, this is what we prefer to do. This is common practice, and this is also considered least privilege, because as soon as that command executes, we'll be back to our traditional user and not have overly too much privilege on the machine. So how does this look? Here's an example on the VM where we're currently in our home directory, and we see that we're as a traditional user because we have a $sign on the end of the prompt. But we want to update the system. To update the system is considered an administrative task. So we will run sudo apt update. Update will then go out to the repositories and update the catalogs. But without the command sudo, we don't have enough privileges to complete it on ourselves. So by completing the term sudo apt update, this will then ask for our own password, not the root password, and update the system. If for some reason our user did not have sudo privileges, it would tell us that we just aren't able to complete this task. If you do have sudo privileges, then you would be able to update the catalog. Okay? Now, as we add and change things for users within our systems, we're going to have 3 new commands. The first command is going to be user add, and it's written like this, all one word, and this is where we create all of our users. If we need to modify one of our users, we would use user mod. And then lastly, if we need to get rid of a user on our system, we would use user delete or user del. Here's an example of creating a user. It is an administrative task, so we would sudo it. We'd use user add. We would add a few options, -m, -c. We want to make the user's home directory, and we want to add a comment because we want to actually add their name as a comment, John Smith, and then the username that we're going to add is J Smith. So the username is J Smith. That is how John Smith will log into the system. But for us to keep track of which J Smith we're talking about, we put a comment on the user. Now, after we're done making the user, we may need to set his password. And again, this is an administrative task. In order to start or create a password, we're going to have to do a sudo passwd jsmith. It'll ask us for the password, ask us to retype it, and it should update successfully. If for some reason we don't type sudo here, we'll just get a message that we're not authorized to set jsmith's password. Now, there might be a few times that we want to modify a user. For instance, we want to change the login. So we can change their login from new name to old name. And so let's say John Smith is no longer John Smith. He changes his name. We can change the username there as well. We could also lock out the user account by using a capital L. That's for lock. For instance, if John Smith goes on a vacation for 2 weeks and we want to make sure the system is secure while he's gone, we could lock out his user account so that way nobody can utilize the account while he's gone. When he comes back, we might want to unlock the account. So user mod -U username. We could also add him to a group. For instance, let's say he has a new role. He's an accountant now. We can add accounting, the group, to his username of jsmith. If for some reason he leaves, we can say user delete, del, of jsmith. But that would leave his home directory. If we want to get rid of the home directory and clean that up off the server as well, we would also put a -r on it to remove the home directory. And remember when we were using home or help pages and man pages, we could man user del and actually read about some of the syntax and some of the options and arguments that we're allowed to use with the command in case we forget. Now, in Linux, we love to use groups. Managing permissions for an individual user is okay when you have a couple people. But what if you need to give 20 people access to a folder? It'd be really hard for you to go to each user and add them to that folder. Instead, we'd prefer to use a group. So we'll create a marketing group in this example, and then we'll put the 20 people in that group. By adding them to the group, we can then just assign the permission to the marketing group, and the user will then have access. Just like in users, to modify groups, there's 3 commands. You can do group add, group modify, or group delete. And they're actually pretty close to the user commands. For example, if I want a new group, I sudo group add developers. Now I have a new group called developers. If I wanted to add that group to JSmith, I'd user mod add group developers to JSmith. This is how you would do that. Now we do want to append it, so we would use the A, because if we don't and we put -G, all of John Smith's groups will be gone and he'll be left with just developers. So we want to make sure that we're appending the group, not just leaving only developers as the only group. Now, modifying the group, we could change the name of the group, we can delete the group. It's pretty much the same way that we did with our users. Group mod -N for name, we can say engineering to developers. So we take developers and rename it to engineering. Now, trust me, I've been doing this for 20 years, and even modifying group names like that confuses me sometimes. There are times where I think about it backwards. So if you're ever in doubt with a command, make sure you're using the --help or the man pages to understand, am I typing this the correct way? Does engineering need to go first, or does developers need to go first? Which one goes first? Now, if for some reason the engineering group didn't exist before, if you tried this out and you flipped it backwards, it will just tell you that the engineering group doesn't exist, so you can't rename it to developers. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we're being safe because multiple users are using our systems. Now, if we're all said and done, we always want to validate that our work was proper. And in order to do that, we have a few commands through the system. The first one would be ID. ID allows us to look at a user identity and see all of the groups and user information about that user. Now be aware, you can run this on your own user without sudo, but if you want to see the ID of other users, you may need sudo access. You can do the same thing for the groups if you wanted to know which group a certain person is in. You'll notice that the username is an argument on here, and it is optional. So if you were logged in and you just type groups and hit enter, you will notice you'll see all the groups that you belong to. By default, the group that you are part of is yourself. So if your username was JSmith, you would also be part of a group called JSmith. This is a really cool feature in Linux where if you want to share your group with another user, you're able to do so. If you also wanted to see who's logged into the system, you could type who, or just for short, W. Remember, sometimes we're pretty lazy as Linux administrators, and there may be aliases that will allow us to type shorter commands. So W will tell you everyone who's logged in. Now this command should work even if you're not an administrator. This is a great way to know that if I am going to be on the system, am I going to affect somebody else? You can see who else is currently logged in. Now, how does a system know what users and groups exist? Well, all of the information will be stored into these 3 different files. The main user database is called the password file, PASSWD. So if you look at the file in etc, PASSWD, you can see all the users. Now be aware, this is a very touchy file, so we may need to sudo to be able to read it. Now, you'll also notice if you look closely that their passwords are not in the password file. But if we look at the shadow file under etc shadow, we'll notice that we'll be able to see their encrypted password. Now, it's only readable by root, and only root can see this one, which is a very good thing, mainly because it has the encrypted user passwords. If you were a malicious attacker, a threat actor, and you were able to get into the shadow file, you can then take all of those encrypted passwords and see if you can reverse engineer them, or crack them. Lastly, we have the group database. We want to know all of the groups and who's in each group, and so there's a file called etc group, which keeps track of every user and all the groups that they are part of. We don't modify these files directly, we utilize the commands on the system to modify them. Hence why we have user add, user mod, user delete, group add, group mod, and group delete. Do not edit these files directly, as you are asking for trouble, okay? We will actually can corrupt the system very quickly by modifying these files directly. But if you want to read the files, cat the files, less the files, more the files, tail the files, head the files, that is okay. You can do that without interfering with the machine. Now here's an ID common example. If I say ID of J. Smith, he has a UID of 1001, his group ID is of 1001, and in his groups of J. Smith, he's also part of developers. See, he's in 1002 of developers. With a single command, we can get a whole bunch of information. This is definitely useful if you're troubleshooting issues, or if you're wondering, am I part of that group? Do I have permissions? Or you want to make sure that somebody else is part of it. This is a great administrative task too, after you've completed a one of the runs, to make sure that you did your job properly. Now, when you first log into the system, you're going to have a profile. Now, we do need to have some profile, and they run through some configuration scripts called dot files. We like to call them dot files because they start with a dot, okay? Any file that starts with a dot is normally a hidden file. Now, in these dot files, we're going to see that we have different things like we can change our command prompts, aliases, a whole bunch of different things within our system, all depending on the administrator's coding. They can give you a message of the day, they can do a whole bunch of cool things to set up the environment for you as the user. Now, the same thing happens when you log into Windows or any other operating system. So this is what actually is going to create your home directory of /home/user. Now, there's going to be two types of profiles. There's going to be a system-wide profile. So under etc profile, you'll notice this as a commonality. etc is where all the system-wide configuration files are normally at. Usually, anything under here is required by root. But you can apply settings to every user on a system by applying it to the etc profile. But on the other hand, if you want to do user-specific changes, or even changes for your own profile that won't affect any other user, you can go into your home directory, and remember the tilde is a shortcut for the home directory, /home/username, same thing as tilde. And in there, if you do an ls-a, as in I want to look at all archival or hidden files, you'll notice you'll have a .bashrc file in there. These files are only the files that's going to pertain to you, no one else. So here are the key profiles that you're going to notice throughout the system, and that you should know if you want to take the Linux Plus examination. The etc profile is your system-wide profile. It only runs one as login, but this is system-wide. All users will be affected. Underneath the bash profile, the .bash profile will be user-specific settings. Again, this will only run once at login. Now, if you want to run a command every time a terminal is opened, the best place would be the .bashrc. This is where you're going to find a lot of people's aliases. So if you don't want to type a long command and you want a new name for that command, you can create yourself an alias under .bashrc. It's a great place to do it. If you want to change the colors of your terminal, change it in .bashrc. You want to change your prompt every time it opens, make those changes in .bashrc. This is the place where you can make changes safely and only affect your profile. Now the skeleton. The skeleton is not a profile, but a skeleton directory. So when you run a user add-m, it takes all of the files out of the skeleton directory and copies them into the user home directory. This is how we can create a standard format. So if for some reason you want every user to have a copy of a file, or you want to give them a base profile like a .bashrc file and allow them to modify them afterwards, you can put it into the skeleton. The skeleton directory allows you to set up pre-existing profiles for your users, but it is only a one-time use. Once the user logs in, that skeleton is now done and it will never run again. Okay? So if you do make a change to the skeleton after a user directory is already created, just know that those files will not be copied over. So you've heard me talk about aliases a few times throughout these videos. What is an alias? Well, it's just a shortcut. It's a custom shortcut. So if you don't want to type a long command and you want a shortcut, you can make one. Now by default, LL is normally in every Linux distribution, but if you echo alias ll-ls-lh and put it in bashrc, every time you type the command ll, it will actually run the command ls-lh in the background. So if you want to create your own aliases, you can do that. It's always fun to write a new alias and give it a shot. Try making an alias that says hello and have the system echo back, hello, how are you today? While it can't really respond, just know that an alias is one of those fun things you can do, but can be useful at times. So today we talked about the root user, learned how strong it is and why we have to be very careful with it. We learned about sudo and how we complete administration tasks with it. We know how to manage users and groups. We now know how to add a user to a group, making sure that we append and not override all groups within that user. We now know how to check to see what an ID is of a group, of a user or a group, allowing us to see it. We know the different files within Etsy, such as password, shadow, and group. We now know what the bashrc and profiles are, and we now know how to use the skeleton directory within the system. So, as you go through here, if you need to, go through it again. As you go through this chapter in Wild Cyber Range, just know that that's what the labs are going to do. We're going to have you practice creating users, creating groups, modifying groups, using ID, doing different things with aliases, and getting very familiar with some of these commands. So that way if you see them on the Linux Plus or somewhere in the real world, you'll know how to do it. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll see you for the next chapter.